What if I told you that one of Christianity's most sacred practices was deliberately removed from entire denominations, and the reasons why might shock you? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial splits in Christian history. For over 1,000 years, confession to a priest was considered essential for salvation by virtually all Christians. Then suddenly, entire churches abandoned it forever. But this wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was a power struggle that changed the course of Western civilization. I'm Faith Flame TV, and today we're uncovering the explosive truth behind why confession disappeared from Protestant churches. And trust me, the real reasons go much deeper than you think. Before we understand why it was removed, we need to understand what confession actually was. In the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, confession, or the sacrament of penance, wasn't just about admitting wrongdoing. It was considered one of 7 essential sacraments, a direct pipeline to God's forgiveness that could only be accessed through ordained priests. The practice was based on several biblical passages, particularly John 20 verse 23, where Jesus tells his apostles, "If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But here's where it gets controversial. By the medieval period, confession had become far more than a spiritual practice. It was a system of social control that would make modern surveillance states jealous. Think about it. In a world where most people couldn't read, where the church controlled education, politics, and even kings, confession gave priests unprecedented power over people's lives. They knew everyone's secrets, fears, and guilt. This wasn't just about theology anymore, it was about breaking free from a system that held entire populations hostage to their own guilt and fear. They said it was just a change in practice. A modernization. A harmless shift in liturgy. But what they didn't say was this: removing confession wasn't about tradition. It wasn't about theology. It was about silencing something. Burying something. Because when you listen long enough to what's not being said, the silence starts to scream. And what it's screaming is the truth. They didn't expect anyone to look back. That was the plan. Erase the ritual. Rewrite the rules. Move forward. But history has a spine. Memory has a pulse. And in the deep archives of forgotten faith, something refuses to stay buried. Because when you pull one thread of the past, the entire robe begins to unravel. If confession was just a ritual, its removal would have been a footnote. But it wasn't. It was a fracture point. A spiritual extinction event disguised as progress. And now, years later, we're living in the aftershock. The silence is louder than ever. And beneath the polished faith, the rod is starting to smell. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that church door in 1517, he wasn't just challenging indulgences, he was declaring war on the entire confession system. Luther's radical claim? Every Christian could confess directly to God without a human intermediary. But this wasn't just theological innovation, it was revolutionary politics. The Reformers built their case on several key biblical principles. Timothy 2:5 There is one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus. Hebrews 4 verse 16 Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence. The priesthood of all believer, every Christian has direct access to God. But here's what most people don't realize. The theological arguments were just the surface. The real reasons were far more explosive. Removing confession wasn't just about salvation, it was about political freedom. When people could no longer be spiritually blackmailed through their confessions, entire power structures crumbled. Protestant regions often became centers of political innovation, democratic ideas, and individual rights. Coincidence? I don't think so. The Catholic confession system required massive financial support, ornate confessionals, trained priests, elaborate ceremonies. Protestant churches redirected these resources toward education, community welfare, and economic development. Perhaps most importantly, removing mandatory confession liberated people from a cycle of guilt, fear, and dependency that kept them spiritually and psychologically enslaved. Protestant confession became voluntary, private, and direct to God, transforming Christianity from a religion of fear to one of personal relationship. The removal of confession triggered a cascade of changes that reshaped the world. But this revolution wasn't without costs. Many argue that removing confession also removed community accountability, structured guidance for moral development, the healing power of human absolution, pastoral counseling, and spiritual direction. Today, the confession divide remains one of the deepest splits in Christianity. Catholic and Orthodox churches maintain that confession to a priest is necessary for full forgiveness, while Protestant churches insist on direct confession to God. But here's the fascinating part: many Protestant churches are quietly reintroducing confession-like practices through counseling, accountability groups, and pastoral care. They've discovered that humans need structured ways to process guilt and receive forgiveness. Modern psychology has actually validated aspects of both approaches. Direct confession to God provides psychological relief and personal empowerment. Confession to another human being offers social accountability and healing. The healthiest approach might combine both elements. So why was confession really removed from Protestant churches? Yes, it was about biblical interpretation. Yes, it was about corruption and abuse. But at its deepest level, it was about human dignity and freedom, the revolutionary idea that every person deserves direct access to the divine without institutional gatekeepers. The removal of confession wasn't just a theological reform, it was one of history's greatest liberation movements, freeing millions from spiritual tyranny and paving the way for the modern world of individual rights, democratic government, and personal empowerment. In dark corners of once crowded sanctuaries, the confessionals sit empty, wooden, hollow, echoing with memory. The air is still, but it feels disturbed. As if something was severed, not gently phased out. Once a sacred threshold for broken souls and whispered sins, these booths are now forgotten relics. Dust gathers where secrets once clung. But this isn't about nostalgia. This is about disappearance. Quiet. Calculated. Intentional. Confession was never just about repentance. It was control. Whoever heard your deepest sin held a fragment of your truth. Multiply that by millions over generations, and suddenly, the church had an archive, not of paper, but of people. Patterns. Stories. Evidence. The BOTH became both sanctuary and surveillance. And someone, somewhere, realized that power could either protect or expose. The moment confession became dangerous wasn't when people lied inside it. It was when they started telling the truth. A priest hears a child's cry. A woman's shame. A man's regret for things he can't undo. But eventually, confessions started sounding alike. Not individual failings, but systemic harm. Institutional betrayal. Over time, those confessions revealed not sins of the flesh, but sins of the structure. Whispers turned to trends. Patterns emerged. Victims were talking, but not to courts. Not to media. To the church itself. Behind those curtains, some priests began recording. Others were silenced. And a few disappeared. Officially transferred. Quietly retired. One even died in what was called a tragic fall from the rectory staircase. But no one asked why he'd been hearing confessions from whistleblowers days before. Then came the reforms. Subtle at first. Confession optional. Then, public acts of forgiveness. Then, community absolution. The booth was still there, but spiritually padlocked. And with each liturgical update, the distance between believer and belief grew. Now congregants sit in neat rows, smiles polished, sins unspoken. The ritual isn't dead. It's just sanitized. Sterilized. Made safe, for the wrong people. Behind the official statements, words like progress, modernity, and inclusivity lurks a much darker truth. Certain churches didn't remove confession to evolve. They removed it to protect themselves. Because when a system is infected, the last thing it wants is a mirror. And confession, for all its theological symbolism, was just that, a mirror too accurate to ignore. Too revealing to survive. When confession disappeared, it didn't take the sins with it. It just made them quieter. Hidden under robes, behind pulpits, inside boardrooms. But silence is not absence. And over time, that silence thickened. Became cultural. Institutional. Generational. Children grew up never hearing about confession. Adults forgot the weight of true accountability. And in that gap, a new kind of sin was born, forgetting. The irony? The very act that once terrified believers, kneeling, vulnerable, exposed, was the same act that protected their soul. It forced the human ego to bend. Now, without confession, there's no checkpoint. No pressure valve. Sins fester. Guilt migrates into the bloodstream of entire congregations. And beneath the hymns and sermons, people carry quiet chaos they were once taught to surrender. But let's go deeper. What if confession wasn't removed just to avoid exposure, but to erase memory? Because some sins aren't just individual, they're architectural. Built into the foundation. Hidden in the bylaws. And if enough people confess them, even anonymously, the illusion collapses. The narrative cracks. Not just about who did what, but about who allowed it. Confession was a threat to the myth of holiness. Not holiness itself, but the myth. The version sold in pulpits and print. And when confession begins to poke holes in that illusion, institutions react. Not with fire. Not with fury. But with silence. Strategic removal. It was outdated, they'll say. No longer relevant. But if something isn't relevant, it fades. It doesn't vanish overnight. This wasn't a fading. It was an exorcism of truth. One so careful, it didn't even look like removal. More like a redesign. And as confession slowly disappeared, a new ritual emerged: performance. Image replaced integrity. Reputation became redemption. And so long as you smiled, tithed, and conformed, no one asked what lived in your conscience. Now, some churches preach grace without grit, forgiveness without facing, love without labor. And the absence of confession becomes the absence of discomfort. But here's the catch: transformation requires discomfort. It's born in tension, grown in friction. Without confession, we aren't healed, we're distracted, entertained, programmed to perform wellness while privately unraveling. So why does this matter now? Because the world is fractured. People are seeking meaning in chaos. And many are returning to churches looking for depth, but only finding aesthetics. Light shows. Motivational speeches. Shallow smiles. But no gravity. No reckoning. No confession. They leave entertained but untouched. Moved but not moved through. Even more tragically, the removal of confession affected justice. Because when people don't have a safe place to confess, they don't. Or worse, they confess to the wrong people. Predators confess to peers who protect them. Victims confess to leaders who dismiss them. And in the absence of structure, abuse festers in the cracks of denial. One former youth leader wrote anonymously, "We didn't remove confession. We reversed it. The people confess to the powerful, and the powerful do nothing." This reversal is the true danger. Not just silence, but inversion. Confession becomes a performance upward, not a surrender downward. And grace is replaced with bureaucracy. But here's the most dangerous part: over time, people forget it was ever different. A new generation rises never knowing what they lost. They worship in churches that feel more like clubs. They hear sermons that avoid discomfort. They sing songs of freedom, while secretly imprisoned by guilt they can't name. That's not progress. That's amnesia. The loss is deeper than ritual. It's neurological. Confession activates something primal in us. It reminds us we are seen, known, forgiven. When removed, the psyche finds substitutes, many of them destructive. Oversharing. Addiction. Chronic anxiety. Because the soul remembers the release it once had, and now grieves its absence. Because at the center of confession was never just a booth, or a priest, or a ritual. It was a truth, that redemption isn't found in hiding. It's found in surrender. And maybe the only way forward is backward. To the silence. To the stillness. To the place where truth wasn't feared, but welcomed. The place where shame died, and grace was born. Walk into many modern churches today, and you'll find comfort. Air conditioning. Coffee stations. A community that smiles wide and sings louder. But stay long enough, and you'll notice something else. An emptiness behind the eyes. A quiet fatigue. People aren't struggling less, they're just confessing less. Not because they're healed, but because they've been taught to hide. Without confession, the weight doesn't disappear, it disperses. Into marriages, friendships, leadership failures, mental breakdowns. People can't figure out why they're exhausted, why anxiety won't leave, why they feel FAQ. It's because we removed the only spiritual mechanism designed to carry weight too heavy for one soul alone. And so people implode in private. Leaders collapse in scandals. Ministries split. And the church wonders why revival hasn't come. But there is no revival without repentance. No freedom without confession. The formula hasn't changed. We just traded it for something easier to market. Theologians will debate doctrine. Leaders will defend their decisions. But beneath all the noise is a universal ache. Something inside us knows that to be human is to fail, and to confess is to come alive again. The act is ancient, primal, sacred. It's not outdated. It's essential. And we are suffering in its absence. Confession wasn't an interruption of faith. It was the engine of it. The rhythm. The recalibration. It kept pride in check. Kept leaders human. Kept people soft. Without it, faith calcifies into performance. Leaders become untouchable. Congregants become spectators. And the church becomes a theater, sacred in form, hollow in function. Some churches rebranded confession as group prayer. Others replaced it with declarations. But there's a difference between declaring freedom and owning your chains. Confession wasn't just about speaking, it was about surrender. It required naming the thing that had power over you, and releasing it in the presence of something holy. In the shadows of all this change, something strange happened. People stopped expecting transformation. They expected good music, good lighting, good social media. But not change. And when you lower the bar that far, eventually people stop showing up at all. Because even the most casual soul knows the difference between being entertained and being healed. The consequences aren't theoretical, they're measurable. Burnout, moral failure, emotional detachment, church hopping, secret addictions, hidden abuse. The data shows us what the spirit already feels: something is broken. And the thing that once fixed it, the raw, trembling act of confession, has been surgically removed in the name of comfort. But confession wasn't comfortable. It was confrontational. It stripped away ego. It exposed pain. But in that space of exposure, people encountered something that no sermon could manufacture: divine empathy. The kind that says, "I see you fully, and still call you holy." That's what people are starving for now. Not another service, but sacred space. There's still time. Still hope. Some churches are quietly bringing it back. Not through ornate booths or scripted prayers, but through culture. A culture that makes honesty safe. A culture that holds space for grief. A culture that values transformation more than impression. That's how revival starts. Not with louder music, but deeper humility. It starts when a leader goes first. When someone stands on a platform, not to declare perfection, but to confess brokenness. That kind of vulnerability doesn't shrink the church, it sets it on fire. People don't follow perfection. They follow honesty. And if confession returns, so will the power people stopped believing in. We can't preach about Jesus healing the leper if we're not willing to touch wounds. We can't quote forgiveness while denying space for confession. And we can't expect transformation in a place that punishes transparency. If the church is to be holy again, it must first be honest. So maybe this is the call. not to condemn what was lost but to rebuild it. Brick by brick. Space by space. Confession isn't old-fashioned. It's countercultural. In a world that rewards curated identity, confession dares us to show what's real. And that more than any trend is what people are secretly dying for. We must ask, what kind of church do we want to be remembered for? One that played it safe? Or one that went into the trenches of the soul? Confession was a trench. A holy one. And maybe the future of faith isn't about innovation. It's about return. A return to the place where grace meets truth, without fear. Because deep down, we all long to be known. And if the church won't make space for that, the world will. But without the sacred anchor, truth becomes weaponized. Vulnerability becomes exploited. And confession, this soul-saving ritual, becomes something transactional instead of transformational. We can't let that happen. Not now. So here's the truth they tried to bury. Confession wasn't removed because it stopped working. It was removed because it worked too well. And the moment people start telling the truth again, unfiltered, unedited, unafraid, something ancient will rise from the ashes. Not tradition. Not ritual. But power. The kind that heals not just hearts but systems. The kind that makes the church sacred again. But here's the question each of us must answer. In gaining our freedom, did we lose something essential about community, accountability, and the healing power of human connection? What do you think? Was removing confession one of history's greatest liberations, or did Protestant churches throw away something precious? Let me know in the comments below. If this deep dive into church history fascinated you, you'll love our series on the hidden truths behind religious practices. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week, we're exploring why some churches removed saints, and the political conspiracy behind it will blow your mind. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth is always deeper than it appears.